Erickson, his idea of deliberate practice is he's explicitly denied the idea that automation is the height of mastery, because he thought you have to continually be shaping yourself by deliberately setting growth goals, and that is actually the highest stage, which has no end, so that you can always be improving in how you do it.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif, here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, great to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. You're always welcome back. Well, Kevin, you said something really interesting recently, which was that Optimal Work, the main goal is to help people to develop mastery. I think you said that. I can quote you on that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I thought that was very interesting, because a lot of times we talk about that helping people grow according to ideals, and especially service, to develop kind of a service-oriented mindset in their work. So I thought it would be great for us to explore the relationship between mastery and service, but then also, and maybe first, to understand a little bit more, what is mastery and how do we develop it? And it seems like there's some interesting insights from neuroscience that bear on how we understand mastery and how we get mastery in a given area. So how's that sound? Mastery, neuroscience, service, ideals?
Yes, it's a great mix, isn't it?
Yeah. It's perfect optimal work. So
that's right.
Maybe we could just start with what is mastery? What do we mean by mastery?
So let's just think of what happens when you sit down to work on some task. Okay, think of a task that you regularly do. So it could be preparing a kind of presentation or giving a kind of talk or some report or an essay. If you sit down and you start to ask yourself, okay, what are the steps of what I'm about to do? That already is the first part of mastery. So mastery is when the steps of a task have become implicit and optimized. And that's a very precise definition, because it involves that you can think explicitly of the steps of what you're about to do. And that really is the beginning of all mastery, is you can explicitly lay out steps. And we often talk about this as, it's like you're using your task attention to think consciously and deliberately about what you're about to do. But then that allows your default attention to better be able to predict what steps come next. And that whole process of shaping your default attention is the next stage. And that's called the implicit stage. And that's where now these steps become second nature through repetition, through practice. So the final thing is that the steps have become implicit and optimized. And that goes to this idea that mastery really is a kind of paradoxical combination of a process and outcomes. So in one way, it's attainable, and in the other, it's unattainable. So the idea, that's really important, that it can always be optimized. So you can always find ways to stretch yourself to do it better.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to say that, saying, okay, what's the simplest definition, and maybe it's a little rough, but it's like mastery is when you get good at something. But I think that raises the question of what exactly are you getting good at? Are you getting good at the strategy, like just executing a series of steps? Or are you getting good at attaining a particular outcome? So for instance, with programming, writing code, writing software, it's like, are you getting good at the process of writing a good program, or are you getting good at the process of, producing something valuable, like a good app or website or something like that? So how do you see the mastery over a process or mastery at attaining an outcome?
I think it's really important that mastery is tied to the real world. So, and as we'll see as we get through this, what you do with real feedback from the real world is essential to growing in mastery. Mastery can't be like building castles in the air. It's always tied to the real improvement. And that means that the outcomes that you're able to produce are more and more reliable. So mastery is what makes us reliable. So to become a professional in any sense of the word means that you can reliably give people the best service. So they rely on your skills. They rely on what you do and in how you do it to actually, in their own lives. There's a trust that they have now in your mastery. So this idea is always that if we didn't have real life outcomes, I don't think we could fully really grow in mastery of anything, because it has to be tested in the real world. Another way of thinking of it is that it's not just that it makes logical sense. Okay, so going again, these 3 stages of mastery. The first is that you can explicitly lay out steps. The second is that you can more implicitly follow these steps. They're just more second nature. And the third is you continually optimize them. So you want to be able to have, in the beginning, a clear sense of what the steps are. But then that knowledge has to go from being what's called declarative knowledge to being procedural knowledge. In the body, that really means that you now are like everything about how to do those particular steps is embodied along with you. Your knowledge has gone from being abstract to actually being embodied in the habits that you've formed. So that it's almost a kind of muscle memory. Another way of thinking of it is we would say that once you've really achieved this implicit stage of mastery, or now it's second nature, you can rely more on gut instincts. There's all this body language. So I think it's really important that mastery is ultimately embodied, and then it's continually optimized. And that's really where you need not just repetition, but growth goals that stretch you.
That's great. So just to get in a little bit to the neuroscience, we talk about, so you have these 3 stages of mastery: the explicit, and then the implicit when it's habitual, and then the optimized when you've reached now kind of a new level of mastery where you're really an expert. So in the implicit phase, we talked about procedural memory. Is that associated with any particular part of the brain? And then related to that, it sounds a lot like the default mode, the default network that we talk about a lot, where the default network will suggest the next step of a task. And it seems like it would be, if you have this implicit strategy, it's kind of like pulling from the next step of that implicit strategy so you don't have to think about it too much. So are those related in the brain? I assume they are.
I think that the neuroscience behind this is yet to be worked out, but we do know a few things. We know that when you are explicitly laying out steps, you're using your prefrontal cortex. And that regulator region that I've been talking about so much lately, the frontoparietal network, you're particularly using that when you're planning steps in advance. So the explicit stage has to be deliberate, which means you're conscious of doing it. It's in the here and now. But then it seems that the procedural has various levels. So on the one hand, your default attention has now been trained so that it can correctly predict the next step when you're working on a current one. Well, that kind of training in your predictions certainly involves your default mode network. But then from there, it goes deeper into what are called the structures of the basal ganglia. And in general, psychiatrists have had a remarkable lack of interest in the basal ganglia, and I include myself in that, because basal ganglia disorders are more neurological disorders, movement disorders. But we do know that any kind of action that can become automatic in some way uses the basal ganglia and probably the cerebellum as well, so that you're able to be honing these automated processes. But this is where a lot of theories of skill acquisition have foundered, because the you have this clear declarative stage, that you have to lay things out consciously. And you have this clear procedural phase. And a lot of models of skill acquisition, and even popular writings on habit formation, end with the implicit stage, as if the highest thing is automation, right? And so, but that's not right, because it would end up being less and less conscious. And how could any human excellence involve less and less use of our highest faculties? That just doesn't make sense. So in this, I think that Anders Ericsson, who wrote Peak, which is my favorite book on performance, is the one who most clearly added the third stage, although it was implicit, I think, in earlier work as well. But Ericsson, his idea of deliberate practice is he's explicitly denied the idea that automation is the height of mastery, because he thought you have to continually be shaping yourself by deliberately setting growth goals, and that is actually the highest stage, which has no end, so that you can always be improving in how you do it. There were other, I guess you would say, theories. Hubert Dreyfus and his brother Stuart came up with their own model of skill acquisition, which, if I were to simplify it a bit, I would say that it has a beginner stage, which is the explicit one we're talking about. It has a more proficient stage, which is procedural, so more implicit. And then it has the expert stage. And they do talk about this expert stage, that there's this ongoing refinement that takes place there. But anyway, I think Anders Ericsson is the one who most clearly had these three stages. And it really fits so well with everything we talk about in optimal work, to be thinking in this way.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Yeah, I wonder if we could now dive in a little bit more to that third stage, the expert stage or the optimized stage, where it seems like one thing that's going on there is that you don't just have one strategy that you've mastered and made implicit, but that you have now many different strategies, and you know which one to apply to a given circumstance. Or maybe another way of putting it is that you have higher level strategies that are composed of many different smaller sub strategies. So I don't know if you could go into exactly the characteristics of that expert level of mastery.
Well, I think it's important to see that anytime you're learning a new skill, you have to progress through these stages. So that will help us then to best understand what takes place in the optimization stage. So like, take for instance, a student writing an essay. So a student here, what they most need from the teacher are clear principles, which is basically the structure of the essay, that you need to have an outline with an introduction, and then you form the arguments, and then you have the conclusion. So they have to be explicitly taught that, and they have to know that, okay, these are the steps, and so the explicit phase is always marked by checkboxes. So that, okay, I can check off, here's my introduction, and so on. But then the teacher also needs to give them the ability to have structured repetition, so that structure becomes more and more implicit. And then the students get better at, when they're, say, reading a book, they're already, maybe they know the prompts for different essays, they're kind of already testing out a thesis statement, how would they be arguing this? So they're already filling out this framework without having to explicitly think about it. It's just there. But at the higher stages, which is once the teacher has given them repeated feedback, particularly positive feedback, showing them new ways of growing, the students would be able to then be learning like, oh, wow, I could have more sophisticated transitions, or I could improve my argumentation. I could appeal to emotions in this way, or there's, vary my sentence length, whatever it might be, that based on what the teacher is showing them, they can get inspired to greater and greater levels of mastery in their writing. They could even be thinking of connecting their arguments to deeper, more fundamental truths, or thinking of their writing as a service to truth. So what happens then in the optimization phase is it becomes more fully human. So it's not just the nuts and bolts of skill, but more ideals are brought into it. So the optimization phase always has this sense you proceed actually from skills to more full living of different ideals. And I think ultimately to bonds and service.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes when we're talking about work and we try to see how you can view your work as an opportunity for service to other people. I think students struggle with that one a little bit. It's like, well, I'm writing this paper and I don't see how if anything, it just, puts a burden on my teacher to read it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like this thing of seeing their work as a way of developing mastery is really key to understanding how it's ultimately oriented towards service. Is that the connection you see?
Exactly. If you're at the explicit stage of mastery, it's hard to necessarily see how this is going to directly be serving others. Because it's not like the steps of an essay are establish a thesis statement, establish the lines of argument, and so on. Serve in the soup kitchen. Service isn't there at the what level. And not even when it's those steps of writing an essay are becoming more implicit and you're starting to have greater ease and flexibility and creativity. Not even there is service so clear yet. I would say it's only at the optimization stage of mastery that you start seeing how you yourself are growing in ideals by the way you're approaching this. So you can say you are becoming a clearer thinker. You're becoming a more persuasive arguer for what's true. As you see yourself growing in those important ways, that actually shows you a path of service. So the path of service, like the real why behind what you're doing, only fully opens up in that optimization stage. Because the explicit is always more about the what, and the implicit is more about the how. But the optimization stage is about the why. And that's where these deeper motives come in. Because ultimately, it has to be about serving others. Otherwise, it would lack all meaning.
How does, I guess, we have in the masterclass, we talk about the ideals of sincerity, humility, and generosity, which you kind of gestured at a little bit there. And then those all together constitute magnanimity, which is really striving for the highest ideals in your work and putting it to the service of others. So I guess you have some thoughts on how sincerity, humility, and generosity play into this whole idea of developing mastery and raise mastery to higher ideals.
Yes. So I think of sincerity, humility, and generosity are what free us from the pitfalls of implicit mastery. Because implicit mastery could become a plateau. You can rotely do things, never really seeking to improve them. Well, that goes directly against sincerity. Because sincerity has to be that you're seeking to grow continually. And that is the first requirement to avoid the plateaus of the implicit stage. So it's not enough that doing a particular thing has become second nature. It's that that needs to be joined with this idea that you're always seeking in some way, you're pursuing excellence progressively in how you do that. So that's where mastery is not just an attainment, but it's really a kind of process that's ongoing. So you're always asking yourself, how can I do this in a new and better way? And to me, that's what sincerity comes down to, this desire to improve, to grow. You mentioned also then the other parts of this triad, but humility to me is essential because to really get past a plateau, you have to be brutally honest with yourself about where your limitations lie. And you have to see them positively as the context in which you grow. And so humility means admitting that we always have so much room to grow, no matter how advanced or successful we might be. And so we see mistakes as opportunities. We even see negative feedback as a service to us, that we're grateful for it. Doesn't mean we believe every, negative person out there, but rather we have this mindset of always wanting to be learning from others, learning from reality, being open to new insights. So that openness to learning and and learning from others is like the hallmark of humility. But even that needs generosity, which is that you're not just optimizing yourself, but you're optimizing for the sake of others as well. That you really want to provide the greatest service to the people in your life. And so mastery here is more about a spirit of service and aiming to serve people in better and better ways. So generosity leads us to find the meaning in always exceeding ourselves. So the sincerity here is not just about seeking to improve ourselves, but seeking to provide ultimately this greater, more reliable service to people around us. So all of these together constitute magnanimity. The desire to, that magnanimity is the crown of all virtues, because what makes every virtue grow to heroic degrees. So that's why it's in some sense the most important of the virtues, because it's perfecting every other virtue. But it has these elements of sincerity, humility, and generosity.
So this is very interesting. So I want to just compare two cases. So it seems like one thing is a plateau, that someone might experience a plateau if they get, maybe a plateau is like getting stuck at the implicit strategy level, and they don't go to the optimization phase and bring in ideals to that. But then there's another case that sometimes happens, maybe it's a little bit more rare, when I recently heard of a case of a writer who has had writer's block for like 10 years and hasn't produced anything. And it seems like this writer has kind of just lost confidence in their abilities. And that can sometimes happen, is that you find someone with seemingly an expert level of mastery or maybe you could think of a lawyer who like loses a big case and then they just lose all confidence in their abilities. So what's going on there, and how does it relate to this framework that we've been discussing so far?
Yeah, so confidence is the felt experience of mastery. So it's what you have when you know that there are the steps that you actually are able to predict the steps that will allow you to attain excellence, by progressing through a task step by step. So confidence has these two elements. It has the end in mind, which is what's the excellence that you're seeking here to attain, and the steps to attain it. So that's why it is essentially what we've been talking about, being able to lay out the steps, aiming for a particular kind of excellence. And you can think of the excellence as being a quality of the finished product, which always is going to be linked to the quality that you've attained in yourself. So you become a more clear writer by writing clearer things. So the clarity in the finished product is like the clarity in yourself. So I think what happens in these kinds of cases is that a person may have been able to produce excellent products, but maybe they didn't reflect on how they did it. So maybe they weren't really able to learn from even their own experience. So it felt lucky. So they felt that they happened to come up with a great outcome in this finished book or whatever it may be, but they're not sure they can do it again. So they rely on bursts of inspiration, like they're looking for that gut feeling that, oh, this is exactly the path. But they don't necessarily know how to explicitly lay out the steps. But that person is very ready to get back to writing. If they were to reflect on what they were doing before that worked, what would be the steps in their mind that they would lay out? I think that they could, through trial and error, start to feel a sense of confidence again. So this is so crucial that they already have good feedback. Let's say they're a successful writer. So maybe they also need to learn more widely about what was going on with their process. Maybe they have to study their own process better. Then they can make it explicit and repeatable. But if you can make it explicit, it can then become implicit, and then it can be optimized in all of these beautiful ways.
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, those are the main questions I had for you on this topic, but and we're kind of closing in on time here, but I don't know if you had any final thoughts you wanted to leave us with.
In one way, that we've been talking about mastery as something that applies to doing particular tasks, but hopefully it becomes clear that once you're really getting to higher levels of mastery in your work, it is yourself that you're really mastering. So that the end of all self-mastery, or at the end, I should say the end of all mastery, is self-mastery, that then allows you to better master the service you give others. So there's this inherent kind of framework of growth, that we grow from mastering what we do to mastering ourselves as we do it. And that is just, and then maybe a continuation of that is doing it for higher and higher motives of love.
Wonderful, Kevin. I think that's a perfect note for us to end on here.
Great, Sharif. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.